This is Dr. Brian Hauck, a surgeon from Alberta, Canada, and a highly prolific hunter of the world. He has 190 big game kills under his belt, including 43 species of sheep, 39 mountain goat species, and 23 of 29 of his North American Super Slam in the 48 countries that he's hunted. And he estimates he's done about 17,000 surgeries in his career as a doctor. Between saving lives every day at the hospital and the insane amount of hunting that he does, he knows a thing or two about anatomy and what it takes to save or end something's life. So I sat down with him to discuss shot placement and what really happens when you make a good or a bad shot in an animal from a physiological perspective. And we discuss how common shot placement philosophy might not be as correct as we think. So here we are at the Tooth of the Arrow shop. We are with Dr. Brian Hauck, who is also my dad, and he is going to break down shot placement like you haven't heard it before. He estimates about 17,000 surgeries in his career as a doctor. He's shot a ton of animals. I've cut a lot of animals up in the field with him, and it sure is different to have that surgeon's perspective going through it. It makes things a lot quicker, and you learn a lot quicker too. So we'll get right into it. We want to start just by discussing the four main kill shots. So if you could just take us through, your options when you shoot an animal, what's going to happen? Barring a miss or something like a neck shot, you have a heart shot, a lung shot, which could be single or double, a liver shot, or the gut. So starting with whatever you want, could you just break down what is happening physiologically with that animal? Why does that certain shot kill them the way it does? How quickly? Break it down.
Okay. Well, thanks, Lee, for asking me to do this because it's a lot of fun. And as a hunter, it's not only just interesting and a lot of fun to understand some of the physiology of why we talk about and we think about shot placement, but it's actually important to put all of this in perspective. And when we've been hunting, and it's a lot of fun to do a little mini autopsy at the end of every hunt when you're cutting up the animal and field harvesting, just to see what it's actually accomplished. And so I've learned a whole lot just by doing that. So if we can first of all go to the diagram of the lungs and the pleural cavity. Okay, so this is a diagram of the lungs and the mediastinum, which really contains the heart. Now, the lungs are inflated with air, and as every hunter knows, when you've seen the lungs and you've finished up, the lungs collapse. So what holds the lungs open for breathing is a vacuum in this space that's called the pleural cavity, and it's two membranes that are very thin. There's a small amount of fluid to lubricate them between them, but it's a vacuum. And what the diaphragm does and the rib cage does is it basically pulls the lungs open to bring in air from outside, and then they relax to expel the air. Now, if this vacuum in the pleural cavity here is broken, so air comes into the pleural cavity, what happens is the lungs collapse. And that's why after we finished a hunt and we open the chest, we see the lungs, they're a fraction of the volume that they were when they're expanded and fill the whole cavity. So what's important to know is that what kills the animal when you shoot it through the lungs, it's not the damage to the lungs at all. What kills the animal is that the lungs collapse and they basically can't breathe. So there's no oxygen that gets into the circulation, and literally within a matter of seconds, their brain is deprived of oxygen, even if their heart can continue to pump, and they die. So ideally what you want to do is you want to collapse both lungs and you get the quickest kill possible. So if you can get that double lung shot where it'll go through the pleural cavity of both lungs are going to collapse. Now, if you have one lung that collapses, most of the time that'll be fatal, but you've still got one functioning lung so that it can take a longer time for the animal to die. It's possible that the animal could survive and recover from one lung that's collapsed, but the biggest thing is that if it can survive on one lung and run, it may be not recoverable. Now, it's also very interesting to understand, and again, you may not have a choice in which lung you can collapse. Usually you won't. But if you have a look at this diagram, the heart is primarily on the left side of the chest. So if you collapse the left lung, what happens is the part will push a little bit more to the left side, and the right lung, being still functional, will take up more of that space. It's not as fatal. If you can collapse the right lung, what happens is the right lung collapses and the left lung will push the heart into the right side of the chest, and that will impair the circulation in and out of the heart. So that'll be more of a fatal shot. But that's the physiology of why those lung shots, and ideally a lung shot, double lung shot, is what we really want to achieve. Then, of course, the next step beyond that is how do you get into those lungs? So broadside, quartering towards, quartering away, frontal shots, etc., which Lee is going to talk about.
Well, I would like to ask you quick. You mentioned it's not the cutting or the damage through the lungs that kills the animal. It's simply the lungs collapsing, the run out of air. So would it matter if you had a great big 2-inch blade, a mechanical broadhead, or hell, throw a meat cleaver through it? Is that going to kill them quicker than poking, let's say, even a field point hole?
So no, it won't actually make a lot of a difference, because once you get a leak of air into that pleural cavity, it's going to deflate very quickly. It's kind of like popping a balloon. It really doesn't make that much of a difference whether you get a big slice in the balloon or you get a small hole. Once there's a leak of air, the lungs are going to collapse. What really is important is getting both lungs, penetration. So that's what we're going to talk about. If you hit a shoulder, the quartering away, quartering towards, frontals, etc. So penetration and getting into both of those pleural cavities is really the important part of this.
So these are some cool pictures that we took this last November of 2022 when we were hunting mule deer. This is just a mule deer doe. I can't remember if you shot this one or I did. But however I shot it, it was rifle shot. However one of us shot it. Like you said at the beginning, we always like to cut open the animals at the end and just see exactly how they died and what killed them, because we can learn so much from it. So we found with this one, the diaphragm hadn't been punctured. The chest cavity was basically completely intact. So after taking off that front shoulder, I cut out all the rib meat and we took these pictures. So you can see exactly what it actually looks like with no damage done to the chest cavity at all.
Yeah, so this picture really demonstrates really well how the lungs collapse, because when they've not collapsed, they basically fill the entire chest cavity. Once they're collapsed, they shrink down to literally a half or less of the volume. But the reason that the animal dies is because no air can move in and out of those lungs when they're collapsed, no oxygenation, and then the animal will die very quickly.
Well, I mean, yeah, you can see how much room is between the inside of the ribs and those lungs. Like, surely there isn't that much room when it's breathing and alive.
There's no room when it's breathing alive. All the space is completely filled with lung, and that pleural cavity that I showed in the diagram before is basically nothing. It's just simply two membranes that are together with a little bit of fluid in between, but there's no actual space, so that the whole chest cavity is completely filled with the lungs.
What is the best shot placement on a broadside deer like this? I mean, as bow hunters, we're typically taught, you can see this would be where that front leg is. You're typically taught go up from that front leg halfway through the body and back a little bit. But what I'm seeing is if you do that, you're at the back of the lungs. You're definitely not shooting near the center of that vital picture. Right here, you're shooting back towards here, and then the liver would be behind the diaphragm in here. So what are your thoughts on that?
Okay, so let's have a look at the picture that we've got for you that demonstrates the anatomy of where the lungs and the heart is positioned in the real animal. Okay, so as you can see, this is a diagram of the anatomy of a deer. And when we're hunting, we have to just try to imagine this anatomy. and try to figure out our shot placement. So as you can see here, the heart is not that big, and it's not a great target to actually go for. So, as I mentioned, that double lung shot is really what you want to try to achieve. So you just need to consider this is the anatomy, and basically this is the target. So you got to imagine, this is a perfectly broadside shot. Remember, ideally we want to try to hit both lungs and both pleural cavities. So whether it's a broadside, you just have to imagine this anatomy, quartering away, quartering toward. There's no question quartering away is, if you had a choice, quartering away is better, because you can put it behind the shoulder of what's toward you and sort of imagine the opposite shoulder. And that's going to be your ideal positioning for hitting the double lungs. Quartering away or quartering toward is definitely trickier, because then you've got a shoulder that you have to try to either maneuver around, target around, or get through. And that's where penetration is key. If you have a frontal, slightly left, slightly front to the right, then of course you're going to miss the shoulder, but you have to be pretty accurate in getting inside the shoulders. Now, if you hit the sternum, which is the chest bone, then again, penetration is critical to actually get through that bone. So a frontal shot is definitely tricky, because you ideally wouldn't want to hit the sternum, and you don't want to hit the shoulders, so you've got that narrow window in between on both sides where you're actually targeting for.
So you'd be finding the most accurate, best penetrating broadhead you could find?
Penetration is key to all of this. If you hit that perfect double lung broadside and you can just go through the ribs, a pencil will get through there. But that's not the reality of it. The reality of it is we've got challenges. There's ribs, there's shoulders, there's a sternum to get through. So however you get through that, the penetration to try to get into the lungs, one or preferably both, is the key to all of this.
So I guess the other thing that I'd look at here on this picture is that shoulder blade, the way it comes up. If you go right up from the back of the leg and then still backwards, like I said before, you're at the back of the lungs. If you go straight up from the back of the leg, then you're in that center area. And I know for certain, for me, for a lot of years, I always went up and back because I was so terrified of hitting that shoulder. But if you hit just inside that shoulder, what are you going through? Are you just going through meat? Or is that a dangerous shot to make with a broadhead a little bit into that arm muscle? What do you think of that?
No, ideally, if you can avoid bone, that's great, because then you're going to go through it better. If you hit a rib, more resistance. If you get through the ribs, that's the least resistance. So, just keeping this anatomy in mind, and the best penetration to try to get into both lung cavities is ideal. Now, as I mentioned, the heart here is a pretty small target. But now we're going to bring up the diagram of the heart and the major blood vessels, and then I'm going to talk to that as killing shots. Okay, so this is a diagram of the heart and the major blood vessels. So first of all, with regards to heart shots, if you can get a shot, rifle or bow, and actually penetrate one of the 4 chambers of the heart, that animal is going to bleed out very, very quickly and die very, very quickly. If you happen to just hit part of the muscle but not get into one of the 4 cavities of the heart or chambers of the heart, it'll bleed out, but it's going to bleed out over a much slower period of time, and the heart potentially can keep pumping, which is going to be a much longer period of time before that animal dies, again, depending on how much of an injury it caused to the muscle. But the other shots that will be fatal are to the major blood vessels. But this is not something that you can target. But when you sort of imagine this and taking your shot and looking at the anatomy, you know, if you hit a big blood vessel that comes out of the heart, close to the heart, and again, this is basically the same target as a double lung shot. Here, this area here, if you hit those big blood vessels, that animal is going to bleed out very, very quickly. Plus, you're also getting into the chest and at least one of the lung cavities. Going forward, up and into the head, the carotid arteries and the big blood vessels here, if you happen to hit one of those, again, this animal is going to bleed out very, very quickly. Coming down, these are not that big of vessels coming down into the front leg. So, you know, eventually they would bleed out, but not quickly.
And how long are we talking? If you, like this happens to hunters all the time, and of course we don't mean to, but if you hit low, you are cutting you're cutting up a lot of stuff there, but how long would you expect an animal to die if all you hit is this lower area down here, or even back in a leg here? What are we looking at?
You know, the blood vessels coming down into the leg are not very big. So if you hit an artery, it's going to bleed out a lot faster than if you hit one of the veins, but they're not that big. And that animal could potentially even run on all four limbs for, you know, a number of minutes, depending on, you know, how quickly they bleed out before they actually die. Now, if you happen to hit any of these big blood vessels, the aorta, the inferior vena cava is coming along the back. But again, this is a very small target. This is like less than an inch. But if you happen to hit those, anything along here, that animal is going to bleed out very quickly, because this is where most of the circulation is going through. They're big and they bleed very fast.
Lucky miss is what that would be.
But if it's a kill, that's great. But this is not something that you can target. Now, the blood vessels that then split and come down into the legs, these also are quite big. So theoretically, you know, if you happen to have a really way off shot, but you happen to hit here into one of these blood vessels, that animal's going to die within a pretty short period of time just because you got lucky. But otherwise, you know, a hind quarter shot it's probably only going to be fatal if the animal, you know, gets an infection and ultimately dies from an infection.
And how long can that take in the wild?
Oh, days, weeks. Or it's possible that the animal could actually recover from it. So, I mean, there's no question. I mean, we've seen it. You know, animals way down the road have had an injury, rifle injury, bow injury, broadheads still in them, and have been able to recover from infection and not actually kill them.
So now we're back at this diagram. It's a really good picture. You can see things very clearly. Well, let's talk about some of those less favorable shots that most of us, and at some point all of us, will unfortunately make. That liver shot, which can be sometimes a lung-liver combo shot, and the gut shot. Now, you can almost always tell what your shot is by looking at the veins of your arrow. That's why I shoot all white veins and a white wrap. Yes, I do lose arrows in snow more often than most people, but when I shoot an animal, I can look at that blood and see exactly what it is. It's that dark purple, dark red, almost purple blood that almost always indicates a liver shot, and then a gut shot. It's stomach content on there. So tell us about those types of shots and what to expect in terms of the lethality and time to kill.
Okay, so if we look at the anatomy here, so this diagram, we look at the heart, and I think this is a little bit better in terms of the positioning of the heart in a real animal. The last diagram we looked at, I think it was pretty accurate, but the impression that the heart was a little bit further up and back than it really is. So this, I think this anatomy shot is actually better in terms of where that heart is. Diaphragm, now the liver is sitting here. Now, the liver is obviously a very critical organ, and it has a huge blood supply. So the blood vessels coming into and out of the liver, which is called the hilus, which is very close to the center of the abdominal cavity and a little bit more to the right side, are big. So if you happen to hit that, again, it's a big blood vessel. Those animals are going to bleed out very, very quickly. If you get, the further you get into the more distal periphery part of the liver, very vascular, they're going to bleed, but the slower it's going to bleed and the longer it's going to take for that animal to bleed out. So that's just simply an understanding of, you know, the liver shots and why one liver shot may be quickly fatal and the other, you might lose that animal. Now, the worst, well, there's a number of worsts, but one of the worst things is a gut shot. So the bowel, and I think in reality, you know, the bowel probably is a little bit bigger proportionally than what this diagram shows. However, the bowel shot through the abdominal cavity into the bowel, lacerating the bowel, will be fatal, but not for probably a number of days, because as the bowel contents, which have a lot of bacteria in them, spill into the abdominal cavity, that's not going to kill the animal quickly at all. The heart is still working, lungs are still working, that animal is going to be able to run for a long period of time. So once the infection sets in the abdominal cavity, the animal is going to get sick. It's going to try to find a place to just hole up, lay down. It's going to get sicker and then eventually die of sepsis, which is an infection. But it can take, you know, multiple days for that to actually happen. A small bowel shot will take longer than a large bowel shot, because the large bowel is going to have a lot more bacteria and kill that animal quicker. But we're talking, you know, a number of days of suffering for that animal.
And so the odds of finding it are very poor, unfortunately, on a gut shot. But I know liver shots, you do find them. I shot a deer once, actually. This, you probably can't see it in the frame, but on our other videos, this whitetail up here, I hit it back a ways, and I ended up hitting one lung and the liver, and it died quite quickly.
Yeah. So one lung is going to collapse, one lung, which is good. And the liver, again, right behind the diaphragm, that's where those big blood vessels are. And you hit those big blood vessels, and then they're going to bleed out very, very quickly.
So we've been hunting and traveling together for a lot of years. We've probably done, I don't know, close to 20 hunts together around the world. And one thing that he taught me to do from a young age that I would like to pass on to everybody watching this video is, if you have downtime before a hunt, and it doesn't have to be a great traveling adventure. If you just hunt whitetail deer at home, do this, you know, before you go out into your stand. You can do this in your stand, but I would Google whatever animal I'm hunting, whether it's pronghorn, bear, whitetail deer, anything, and just click through these pictures on Google and tell yourself, where would you place an arrow on that animal? Get used to the way they stand, common positions and their anatomy, and just get very used to how that animal looks for when it comes time to make your shot. So if we have this picture here, I think most people would be taking this shot. You're bow hunting, where would you put an arrow on this animal?
So, you know, different animals, exactly as you say, different animals have different anatomy. So it's useful to just get those diagrams and just try to visualize where the shoulder is, where the bones are, and have that in your mind when you're just trying to pick the placement. But, you know, so from what we saw from the previous diagrams, you know, go up, straight up the leg. So that is where you're going to want to try to just target. So if you hit that, great, you're perfect. If you go a little forward, you know, you're into shoulder, and that's where penetration is so important. If you go a little back, you're still into some lung. You go a little bit further back, diaphragm, liver. You go high, then you're getting into the area where those major blood vessels are. Now the lungs go really low. They go right down to basically the bottom part of the body, and the heart is in there. So if you then are a little bit lower, you're still into the lungs or the heart. So, you know, that's basically, that's the target, and then you've got those margins around it that are still fatal. If you say, okay, well, I'm going to go a little bit further back and I'm going to aim there, great, if that's where you hit. No problem. If you go a little bit forward, going high, not a problem. Going low, now you're potentially getting out of the lungs. Going further back, you're into a less fatal part of the liver or into the guts.
So you're saying basically you want to take that picture of your vitals and aim center of mass of it. Don't be thinking too much about aiming back just to avoid that front shoulder. You think good penetration and then aim center of mass and you can't go wrong.
Chances are you're not going to hit the exact spot that you're aiming for. You're going to hit somewhere around in that circle. So just imagining the most fatal area around that as your target and the best chance of getting into that area. And then, it makes a big difference on what animal you're hunting. If you're hunting a moose with my rifle, I don't want to hit the shoulder, because if I hit that shoulder, even with a big rifle, it may not kill that animal. If you've got a white-tailed deer, pronghorn, smaller animal, and you hit the shoulder, penetration is good, you probably are going to go through that shoulder. So considering the size of the animal you're after will also make a bit of a difference in where you consider the fatal zone. But in a moose, the fatal zone of the lungs is hugely bigger than the fatal zone of a white-tailed deer.
Yeah, so that is a good point, right? Like on a white-tailed deer, fixed blade broadhead, I shoot a 70-pound bow. I do exactly what you say. I aim right up from that shoulder, and I don't worry if I hit into that shoulder because I know it's not a massive animal. My arrow's going to get through it. But if I'm looking at an Alaska Yukon moose or some of these great big animals in Africa, I might be a little bit more pushing my arrow towards the back of the animal because, like you say, the vitals are still so massive. And then I'm also away from that front shoulder, which on an animal like a moose, I would be a little bit worried about it.
That's right, because a moose, the fatal zone is going to be a little further back and bigger than on a white-tailed deer, and you don't want to hit the shoulder in a moose.
Yeah, so this is where it comes down to, it's not one size fits all with shot placement, right? Coos deer, I would almost shoot it like I was shooting it with a rifle. I would be totally fine putting an arrow through both shoulders of a coos deer, but moose is a totally different game. And then, bears are another one worth talking about. So if we look at this anatomy diagram of a black bear, you can see that just where everything sits in relation to that front leg is a little bit different than on a deer. And you're going to find some variation, like we already did with those whitetail pictures, of different diagrams are slightly different. So, but a bear is one that is it's completely different than a whitetail in terms of where that heart sits. So what would you say about that?
Exactly. So, with a bear, theoretically, you look at the leg, the back of the leg, and then, which is about here, and then go up. The white-tailed deer, we're talking about the bone, the humerus part of the bone, and then up. But a bear, the anatomy is a little bit different. Everything is a little bit further back for that fatal zone.
Yeah, you can see right here, your heart is much more central in the lungs as opposed to the deer where the heart is very forward in the lungs. So now I want to ask, you've done so much hunting, so many different species. Do you have any particularly memorable shots of where you aimed and where you hit and something surprised you, something didn't go according to plan?
Well, I'll tell you, there's a number of things that didn't go quite according to plan, but, one that did was this last September on Vancouver Island when I was hunting a Roosevelt elk, and they are a big animal, 1,200 pounds. I got a phenomenal elk, big into Boone and Crockett, and, I had the luxury of, he didn't know we were there, waiting, watching him, let him walk, let him move, and I just waited until he had that quartering away. And then I just aimed back behind the shoulder, so hit him perfectly through the lungs and went up forward and the bullet ended up somewhere in the shoulder on the opposite side. So it was a perfect double lung shot, and he was down, literally within seconds for a 1,200-pound animal.
So that's a really good example of just when things go right. When you study your anatomy, when you know what you're doing, you make a good shot, things die quickly, you find your animal. So then do you have anywhere you're well studied in this, but something just didn't go the way it should and surprised you?
So, I've been pretty lucky over my hunting career, which has been, a number of decades now, and that I think we all have, but I've lost 2 animals, and they happen to be, does, mule deer does, which we hunt every year because we love it and the meat is great, and don't know what went wrong. Somehow shot placement obviously was not correct. There was blood, there was hair, tracked them for as long as we possibly could until there was just nothing further. But in those kind of situations, you just never know what actually went wrong.
So then that brings me to a point I want to address. You hear all the time when you're talking with hunters, I made a perfect shot. Why didn't I find it? How would you address that type of comment?
You thought you made a perfect shot, but obviously it wasn't. And, we can't. I mean, the reality of it is at a range, on a target, is just totally different than when you're in a hunting situation where there's so many more variables that, even if we think we made that perfect shot, the reality is we don't. And even when we get good kills, quick kills, like we've looked at shot placement afterwards, and I try to do this all the time. Where did that bullet go in? What was the track? What killed it? And most of the time, even if, the bullet didn't go where we were actually aiming, because of that kill zone, we still managed to kill the animals. But on those ones where it just does not go right, we don't understand.
And I've certainly made shots where I thought things were perfect or close to it, and you lose your animal, or you come to find that you did make a bad shot. But it is worth pointing out that you can make a perfect shot, but animals' instincts are so insane that your perfect shot can be rendered a wound or even a miss just because of how that animal reacts after you've done your job.
So a miss or even a wound. I mean, a miss, everybody goes home at the end of the day and no animal suffers. The wounded and the lost animal, that's the worst case scenario.
So that's when we talk about, on this channel, we talk a lot about paper tuning and fine tuning your bow and taking the time to spine match your arrows and fletching your own arrows so that you can do 4 fletch versus 3 fletch. We talk about all this stuff and I hear it all the time. Why would I do that? My arrows fly quite well as they are. Why would I put in all this extra time to be 1% better? Well, this is exactly why, because we owe it to these animals to be 1% better if we can be. Do you have any thoughts on that type of stuff?
The thing is, you want to look at every single aspect that you have control of. Now, the biggest aspect is the person that's behind the rifle or the bow. That's the biggest. But if you can try to optimize everything else, the accuracy of your rifle or a bow, take that to your advantage, and you're likely gonna have fewer bad outcomes.
Yeah, and I mean, I started this shop and I started doing all my own work because I grew up watching him do all his own work on his rifles. And the biggest thing that I've taken from it is it's not like doing all my own work and becoming, proficient in DIY archery has made me never lose an animal. I mean, you bow hunt, you're going to lose animals. But what I really value behind that type of stuff is if I make a bad shot and I know it was me, I know 100% of it was me. There was no one to blame. I built my bowstrings, I built my arrows, I tuned my bow, I did everything. And I like that I can take that level of responsibility, because at the end of the day when you're hunting, it's you and that animal.
And it's the same with rifle. You know, especially if you're doing longer range shots, you know, you want to have the optimal accuracy with that rifle. And then it gives the hunter margin of error a little bit more of a margin of error, because we're not perfect.
No, we aren't. And even if we are, like we said before, things can happen during the flight of that arrow or even the flight of that bullet, less likely, but things can happen that make it not perfect.
Yeah, I mean, there's string jumps, there's wind, you know, there's a possible blade of grass that you might hit, a branch. There's so many variables that can happen that, you know, you just optimize every one that you can control.
Do you have any last thoughts you want to add?
So this has been a lot of fun going through all of this today. And, you know, specifically for the archery, which Lee, that's his passion. You know, I mean, accuracy is key. Understanding the anatomy and the physiology is key. But penetration, if there's one thing when it comes to archery that is much more of an aspect than it is with rifle hunting, which is what I do, is that penetration and trying to get through and get both of those lungs is more important than anything else. But again, you know, if you can get that pass through, you can get the blood trail, that's absolutely ideal. But as we talked about, you know, getting perfection, we don't always achieve perfection. So, you know, even if you don't get a complete pass through, but you do get both lungs, that animal is going to not go that far, and you're much more likely going to find it.
Good. Well, this was a lot of fun. Now, I've asked him a lot of questions. It's not very common that you get the opportunity to sit down with someone who's been both a surgeon and a hunter for the better part of their life. So we want to give the opportunity for you guys to ask some questions. If we're going to do another video, you guys put in your questions in the comments here. You can send us questions on email, Instagram, Facebook, whatever you want. Give us your questions for him, and we're going to sit down another time here and go through them one by one and answer your questions. We'll shout you out. We'll do it all. So thanks for joining me with this today. I hope you guys learned something.